Hello and welcome to another edition of Iowa News and Views. I'm your host, Derek Maurer, sitting in for Joe Bolcom, who is away doing the people's business. We have a great show this time for you where our topic is Who's Regulating the Regulators? And our guests are two individuals who have taken a civic responsibility to try to see that our laws are meaningfully enforced. We're also going to talk with Joe by phone from Des Moines in just a minute, but first I want to welcome all our new viewers in Mason City and in Council Bluffs, Omaha, two communities that have recently joined the iNews network. And just to let you know that that brings our network up to 17 communities, and we're seen on cable systems serving 500,000 homes. So by iNews arithmetic, that means 1.5 million people could be seeing each and every edition. They can, and we hope they will. Just to let you know, for our new viewers, what iNews is, we're a weekly public affairs discussion show. We like to feature topics of relevance to Iowans and neighboring communities, and we're here for you. So let's get to the phone and talk to Joe and get our State House report, and then we'll get into our topic. Joe, are you there?
Hi there, Derek. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing very good.
Okay. Well, let's get right to it. I understand there's some stuff going on with campaign finance laws over there, and I want you to tell us about it.
Well, yes. Last year, a federal judge struck down Iowa's campaign finance law, or part of it, that basically opened up the possibility for corporations to make direct contributions to political candidates. And the proposal surfacing out there right now is an effort to try and close that loophole by saying that there's enough money in politics without corporations being able to make direct contributions. Typically, corporations have a political action committee that does that. And we need to close that loophole. There's been a bit of discussion about it. Apparently, there's going to be a leadership bill by leadership to try and stop corporate contributions, or essentially to have the effect of drowning out the voice of working people.
Well, I guess at least we'd like to know what kind of money is coming into campaigns. Is that part of this too?
Well, basically the court's decision was corporations could make contributions and not have to report them. Yes, if we fix this, which there's some doubt whether we will, we'd certainly it would take away any requirement that there would be reporting because they wouldn't have the contributions to give. Right now, corporations have plenty of power in the political process, and it's a loophole we definitely need to close, and hopefully we can work together with Republicans to do that.
Okay, we'll be watching that issue in the coming weeks. I understand something just happened with our English-only bill, a bill to make English the official language of state reports and documents.
Right. That bill creating essentially making English the official language of the state passed in the Senate. It's passed in the House committee. It's likely to pass in the entire House. It's what one would call unnecessary legislation. As our state grows more diverse, it's important that we be open and accepting of our differences, and it seems to me that this is more or less a slap in the face to our immigrant friends that are here trying to learn the language. There's clearly a lot of incentive to learn the language, and as a way of employment, eating out, driving your car. You have to pretty much know how to read English and the like. And one of the things that we've heard recently is the governor is looking at probably vetoing that bill, which is very good news.
Well, maybe by the time people see this, then that won't be an issue anymore.
I would hope that. I know that there's a lot of concern about this bill, but from reports I've read, it appears that the governor, Tom Vilsack, is going to veto this legislation, which would be welcomed.
Okay, well, we're going to be talking with Dave and Wallace about water quality here on this edition, and do you have anything to tell us about that?
Well, water quality is an issue this legislative session. The governor has an initiative to try and essentially bring forward an effort to begin to monitor our state's waters, our rivers, streams, and groundwater. It's something that we haven't done a very good job of for a very long time, and the governor governor has an initiative to spend $1 million developing some stations, monitoring stations around the state, so that we can see how good a job we're doing on the land, whether it be agriculture, or whether it be runoff from cities or from sewer plants, and that's a proposal the governor has. There's also another proposal for a watershed protection program through the Department of Ag Stewardship, and Patty Judge, the new head of that department, has put forward, and the governor is supporting $1,300,000 on that. And so this bill right now will start in the House. There's still a lot of negotiating going on, I understand, about this, but I just encourage people that are concerned about water quality to touch base with their legislators to keep this moving. The governor has been very supportive of trying to get a handle on this. I know your talks tonight will give people a little bit more detail about some of the issues that the state faces. I think this monitoring effort would go a long way to help us figure out what we need to do next.
Okay. Well, Joe, thanks for joining us. We'll let you get back to your dinner that you're doing there, and we'll look for you back here.
Have a good show.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Well, with that, why don't we turn to our topic. Our guests this evening are Wally Taylor. Wally is founder of the Midwest Environmental Law Center, a longtime activist, a Cedar Rapids lawyer who's been involved in many issues and very active in Sierra Club at the state level and many other things. And we're also joined by Dave Riley. Dave chairs the board of directors of Environmental Advocates here in Iowa City, which is an organization, a nonprofit organization of volunteers and citizens that has been working for more than 10 years to get citizens involved in environmental issues and seeing that things work toward a better and cleaner environment. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Our topic is who's regulating the regulators, and I think what that implies is that maybe there's something more than simple law that we need to make sure that our environment is protected. Wally, we have laws in place. There are plenty of them. Many of them are the result of I think a pretty broad consensus on the part of citizens and the electorate that we need to protect the environment. Isn't that enough?
Well, let me explain first of all how the Clean Water Act works. That's the main law we're talking about as far as clean water is concerned. There are a number of features. One is what are called point sources. Those are industries, cities, even some smaller private entities like trailer courts, for example, who dump their waste into surface waters, lakes, streams, rivers, and they have to get permits. They're called NPDES permits. National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits.
Let's say that a little slower then.
National Pollution Discharge Elimination System.
Okay.
Permits.
Point source.
Right, for point sources. Those are sources that you can identify and say, here's where the pollution is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And even animal feedlots are point sources. There are also non-point sources. That's stormwater runoff, agricultural runoff, those kinds of sources that you really can't pinpoint very easily. Part of the Clean Water Act also concerns wetlands, which also is part of water quality because wetlands are an important feature in filtering pollutants before those pollutants go into rivers, streams, and lakes. And there are permits that are necessary for those as well. If you're going to dredge or fill in a wetland, you have to get a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. So that's kind of a general view of the Clean Water Act. As far as the regulation, the point sources are regulated first of all by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's a federal agency. But in Iowa and many other states, the EPA has delegated the actual enforcement duties to the state agency that regulates the environment. In this case, it's the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. And so it's the Iowa DNR that really regulates or doesn't regulate the Clean Water Act in terms of point sources. In terms of non-point, there really isn't a lot of regulation. And that's one of the problems that we have with non-point. There's no real regulatory system in place. With respect to the wetlands, as I said, the Army Corps of Engineers is the primary regulator for wetlands. The problem that we see is that oftentimes these regulators either are understaffed, underfunded, or they're politically motivated by the regulated entities, and so they don't always do as good a job as they should.
Okay, so what we have is a federal law, and there are also state laws that support this, that regulates the kind of discharges you can have into either groundwater or surface water. And then beyond that, we have specific regulations covering the different pollutants. And we have a state agency that's basically in charge of watching the situation to see whether the laws are met.
Right.
Dave, are they doing a good job?
Well, Environmental Advocates was involved this summer with a group from Winona, Minnesota called Mississippi River Revival that looked at specific point source discharge permits. And within the state of Iowa, I think there are 1,700 entities that are allowed to discharge their waste, usually treated waste, into the surface waters. And over half of those within the last year had some type of violation. It may have been a minor violation, but nonetheless a violation. We specifically looked at major dischargers, of which there were 170 major discharges, and we were basing that on quantity of discharge or effluent. And over 100 of those had discharge problems. And
Okay, so who are we talking about?
in many cases, they were city entities here in Iowa City. Iowa City itself, their municipal wastewater plant had a problem with meeting their permit requirements. Some big corporations around the state as well were part of that list.
And we might call all of these polluters, but I think as people understand that term, it sounds like something that well, you're just not allowed to pollute at all. But I think the case is something different.
Sure. Generally speaking, as far as a municipal wastewater plant is concerned, the treatment undergoing, and if you live in a city, you're paying your bills for water treatment or wastewater treatment. You're treating biologics going through the system. You're not treating metals. You're not treating those types of things. And they're allowed to discharge at a certain amount. Hopefully the treatment does take care of that. In Iowa City, we had some problems with cyanide, chlorine, mercury, and those things are not treated by the system.
That's a very good point, that these NPDES permits allow pollution. That's really what they do.
Sure.
But they attempt to put limits on that pollution. What I found in my experience many times, though, is that these permits are, if you want to say phony, that term's been used before.
Mm-hmm.
And by that I mean that the Iowa DNR, when they would issue these permits, would allow the polluters to pollute whatever they wanted to, and that would be the limits in the permit. Mm-hmm. It would be driven by what the polluter wants to emit, not what a good water quality would demand.
Okay, well, I guess that's something different than I expected. I thought probably the law set certain levels and said, well, it's not safe to have a higher level of mercury or cyanide or ammonia than this, and so that would be the level. But you're saying that
no, the law itself,
they've set their own levels.
Yeah. The Clean Water Act itself doesn't set any levels, but each agency adopts regulations which have the force of law, but they're created and approved by the agency. And if the agency wants to set those limits high, they can do that.
Okay.
And the way a way, if you're going to operate in that kind of environment, it seems to me that it would be smart to start monitoring your surface water sources downstream from someone polluting, or upstream and finding out what impact those levels have. And the state has either been reluctant to do that or isn't unwilling to look at data they've collected to do that, to find out what kind of impact, be it human health impact or ecological impact, that these sources are emitting.
Okay. Well, just to kind of maybe put a wrap on this point, we hear a lot about parts per million and a lot of debate over what is a safe level of certain kinds of contamination. And, you know, often what we hear is that, oh, well, that's just a couple of parts per billion, and that's even lower than the ambient level of this pollutant that you would expect. And so what we're discharging into the water really is safe. Do we know that?
Well, perhaps Dave knows more about this than I do, but it seems like the science is not that good. You get scientists all over the board on what's safe, what isn't, what should be the right level, what shouldn't be, and perhaps that's where we ought to be going with some of this, is finding the good science, if there is such.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Go ahead.
Most of the studies are based on animal models, and depending on how good or bad those studies are, certainly they give a worst case scenario, but very few toxics are used on humans unless it's been some industrial accident, which there have been very few of those. So it's kind of our best guess with a conservative factor built in, but there's never been a study that says if you have chemical X, Y, and Z in the system, what impact will those three have together? So at very best, it's uncertain.
Okay. Well, let's hold that thought for just a minute while I remind our viewers that you're watching Iowa News and Views. We come to you every week at this time, and I guess at some point we put up our email address, and we know you're out there, and we want to hear from you because we're really interested in what you think of our show, and if you have ideas for topics and guests, we'd love to hear from you. We have an email, we have a web page, you can visit that. At the end of the show you'll see a phone number, and all of this is just trying to say, let us hear from you. If you have any thoughts about our show at all, let us know, and we'll take that into account. Now let's get back to our discussion. We don't know exactly what's safe, but we do proceed anyway with some kind of regulation. I mentioned at the top of the show that you're each involved in some kind of action to hold the regulating agencies accountable. Dave, let's start with you and environmental advocates, and because you mentioned that.
Yep.
Tell us what's going on.
Part of the process I was talking about earlier in the show was looking at permits around the state. And what we eventually did was Mississippi River Revival sent out what's called a 60-day notice letter. And that gives, or was sent out to the habitual violators around the state. There were 10 that we sent out. And that's giving notice that DNR is not holding their part of the law or upholding the part of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and it allows us to file a citizen lawsuit. And the 60-day notice says you must fix these problems within 60 days, or the DNR must come to some agreement with you about fixing the problems. And after that 60-day period is over, then the citizens who are involved in filing the notice have a right to sue those entities or the DNR if permits continue to happen after that point. So we were just kind of meeting the end of our 60 days. We filed it at the end of January, and we're kind of seeing what the DNR is going to do, and we'll watch those permits come in on the monthly recording reports in the spring and summer.
Okay. Wally, you're involved in some action with the EPA.
Right. There's a part of the Clean Water Act that I didn't mention that's called Total Maximum Daily Loads, or TMDLs. One of the first things you learn in environmental law is there's an acronym for everything. But what a total maximum daily load is, it's an attempt to get around this problem we were talking about of not having any definite handle on what ought to go into the water. And what this concept is there is a maximum amount of pollutants that ought to go into the waters on a daily basis in order to maintain good water quality. And this includes non-point as well as point sources. And the TMDLs are much broader than a permit for a point source. They're a whole concept of how do you control pollution in general. So a TMDL could include permits, it could include filter strips along waterways, it could include stream bank.
So it's not looking at pollution sources, it's looking at the pollution load in the
Right.
stream.
Yeah, but eventually you get to the sources, but the end result is the important thing and not the output itself.
Uh-huh.
And the Iowa DNR, in true fashion, has been way behind the curve on this. And in fact, Iowa was the last state to even come to grips with it at all. And the first part of the process is to create what's called an impaired waters list. That's a designation of all the waters in the state that don't meet water quality standards. And the Iowa DNR finally last fall came up with a purported list that had some 50 water bodies where they said the water quality was impaired. States similar to Iowa have had hundreds. And I understand that the EPA now has developed their own list of some 200 or so impaired waters.
So what do you filed suit in federal court then
Right.
over this issue of
Right.
TMDLs?
And we've sued the EPA because they're the ones who ultimately have the responsibility for making sure the DNR does the job right. And what we're asking for is, first of all, a good impaired waters list, and then establishment of TMDLs for all of those impaired waters.
Okay.
And what the court probably will do is set out a reasonable timetable for that to be done.
Okay. So where you're at in the process is what?
We have filed the suit. We're waiting for the official response from EPA. And we are planning to have a meeting with EPA yet this week to,
Okay.
to see if there's some common ground here that we can perhaps settle the case or at least narrow the issues.
Well, we'll see if we can get an update from you for our next show.
Okay.
Dave, environmental advocates filed, was party to this filing
The
for the 60-day notice
yep.
with the city of Iowa City. Tell us what you found out about how the city was planning to take care of its problem.
The city itself has begun looking at their wastewater issues. From what I understand, they are starting to do some of the things outlined in a they had a 5-year compliance plan at some point, and I think we were reaching the end of that 5-year plan, and they had not acted, I don't believe, in good faith in meeting the deadlines of the 5-year plan. I think they've accelerated that process somewhat.
Was this plan on paper?
You know, I believe when we spoke to them before the report was released and the 60-day notice was filed, that a lot of the agreements and negotiations they had with DNR were verbal, and some of it may have been on paper and some of it may not have been.
But
And
no way for a good citizen to know.
That was a concern. All of those things should be in the local DNR office for citizens to review. It's public information. And when we reviewed their file and everyone else on the list, the record keeping for that was non-existent.
Okay.
And that was a problem. It puts both the DNR and someone trying to act in good faith, in this case perhaps the city, in a tough position when we come asking them about it.
Okay.
So.
I'm afraid we have to wrap up because our show has quickly slipped by on us, but maybe I can ask each of you for just a last word real quickly about what citizens can do to make sure that our environmental regulations, such as they are really enforced.
I think one thing is demand the legislators put some teeth in the law. And the other thing, of course, is to just make sure the DNR is doing its job and be vocal, be outspoken, be concerned, be active.
Okay, Dave?
And I would agree with everything he says, and I would also like to say that the new DNR director, Paul Johnson, has been very open to some of these problems. He's meeting with groups, he's listening, and that's a refreshing change. And
Yeah, it's a great change.
And I think that in itself, we're on hopefully a positive path.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much for being here. It's been a good discussion, and I know we've just touched the surface, but hopefully that sparks some renewed interest and lets people know that there really is something we can do. Personally, I'm amazed that it ever became part of law that citizens could sue the government to make sure the law is enforced. I'm not sure we could get that today, but but I'm glad we have it, and I'm glad you're both doing what you're doing. Thanks again for being here. You've been watching Iowa News and Views, your weekly current events and public affairs talk show. We're just a bunch of volunteers who put this show together, but we're very grateful for your time, for all the help we've received from everyone around the state. I'd like to acknowledge financial support from environmental advocates and from the Center for Alternative Media. They've helped keep us on the air, bringing this show to you every week. Tune in again next time. Thanks very much.